In a place where time seemed to move slower, where the days blurred into a soft, gentle sameness, there stood a building called Sunnyside. It wasn't particularly sunny, nor was it anything special, but it was home to those who had lived long lives and were now spending their final years in the quiet company of one another. The air inside always carried a strange mix of smells, the clean, sharp scent of disinfectant fighting a losing battle with the softer, sweeter smell of lavender potpourri and old paper. The sounds were just as consistent, the soft shuffling of slippers on polished floors, the low murmur of television sets from behind closed doors, and the gentle clinking of cutlery as meals were served in the big, bright dining hall in the corner of the main common room, a large space with mismatched armchairs and a big, silent television sat an old upright piano. It was a dark wood color, though you could barely tell under the fine layer of dust that settled on it every day. The corners were chipped, and one of its legs was propped up with a folded piece of cardboard to stop it from wobbling. Its ivory keys had yellowed with age, some of them slightly chipped, looking like an old, tired smile. For years, the piano had been nothing more than a piece of furniture, a place where residents sometimes left their cups of tea or a forgotten newspaper. It was a ghost in the room, just like some of the people who lived there. And then there was her. An old woman, in her early 80s, with hair as white as fresh snow and skin as thin and delicate as paper. Her name was Ilara, but most of the staff and newer residents just knew her as the quiet one who sat by the window. She would spend hours there, in her favorite armchair, a worn-out book resting open but unread on her lap. Her gaze was always fixed on the world outside, on the cars that passed by, on the children who sometimes played in the park across the street, on the changing colors of the leaves on the old oak tree. She rarely spoke, and when she did, her voice was so soft and thin you had to lean in just to catch the words. She was a part of the background, a piece of the quiet scenery of Sunnyside. A forgotten girl in a home full of forgotten stories. During the day, Ilara was almost invisible. She would eat her meals alone, carefully pushing her food around the plate with her fork, her eyes distant. She would nod politely when someone spoke to her, but she never started a conversation herself. The other residents, lost in their own routines and aches, barely noticed her presence. To them, she was just Ilara, the woman who never made a sound. They had no idea that inside this small, quiet frame was a universe of music, a storm of emotion waiting to be unleashed. The change would only come when the sun went down. As the hallways grew dark and the home settled into a deep, echoing silence, a different Ilara would emerge. It started around 10 o'clock every night, long after most residents had gone to bed. That's when the night shift began. And that's when Maria, a young nurse in her 20s, would hear the first few notes. Maria was new to Sunnyside, still getting used to the slow, quiet rhythm of the place. Her nights were mostly spent doing rounds, checking on residents, and filling out charts at the nurse's station, which was just down the hall from the common room. The first time she heard it, she thought she was imagining things. A few delicate, hesitant notes from the old piano, like someone testing the water. She got up to investigate, but by the time she reached the common room, the sound had stopped. The room was empty, bathed in the faint glow of the emergency exit light. A few nights later, she heard it again. This time it wasn't just a few notes. It was a full melody, a complex and beautiful piece of music she didn't recognize. It was coming from the common room. She walked quietly down the hall, her soft-soled shoes making no sound on the floor. Peeking around the doorway, she saw a sight that stopped her in her tracks. There, at the old dusty piano, sat Ilara. The woman who barely spoke a word during the day was transformed. Her back was straight, her shoulders held with a grace Maria had never seen before. Her white hair seemed to catch the dim light, and her hands, which usually trembled slightly as she held her teacup, were moving across the yellowed keys with a strength and confidence that was breathtaking. The music was not perfect. Maria knew enough about music to tell that. There were moments when a note was slightly off or a tempo was rushed, as if a memory was being chased and caught just in time. But it didn't matter. The technical flaws were what made it so incredibly human, so real. This wasn't a performance. It was an outpouring. Each note was filled with a powerful emotion, a deep, haunting sadness one moment, followed by a burst of pure, unadulterated joy the next. It was like listening to a lifetime of stories all being told at once. It was the sound of love and loss, of hope and despair, of a heart that had felt everything and was now letting it all pour out through her fingertips. Maria stood frozen in the doorway, feeling like she was intruding on something sacred, something intensely private. She watched as Alara's eyes were closed, her face a mask of concentration and emotion. She wasn't just playing the piano. She was living inside the music, reliving every moment that had inspired it. The young nurse felt a lump form in her throat. She had never heard anything so beautiful, so raw, so full of life. From that night on, Maria made a point to listen. Every night, around the same time, Alara would make her way to the common room. And every night, Maria would find a quiet spot near the nurse's station and let the music wash over her. She never told anyone. This was their secret. She would sometimes see the other nurses look up from their charts, a puzzled expression on their faces as the sound drifted down the hall. "Do you hear that?" One of them might ask. "Yeah, the old piano is acting up again," another would say, and they would go back to their work, not understanding. Not hearing what Maria heard. Maria began to see Alara differently during the day. She saw the sadness in her eyes, the loneliness in her posture, and she understood. The music was Alara's true voice. It was the only way she could still speak to the world, the only way she could express the vibrant, passionate person she was inside. The quiet woman by the window was just a shell. The real Alara was the ghost who played the piano in the dead of night, a forgotten girl whose music was anything but. And as Maria listened, she felt a growing sense of responsibility, a need to protect this beautiful, fragile secret. She had no idea that soon the whole world would be wanting to listen in. The idea first planted itself in Maria's mind during a routine staff meeting. The director of the home, a man named Mr. Henderson, who always seemed more concerned with budgets than with people, was going over a list of proposed cutbacks. He talked about reducing the hours for the cleaning staff and switching to a cheaper brand of coffee. Then he mentioned the common room. "And that old piano," he had said, tapping his pen on his clipboard. "It takes up a significant amount of space, and to my knowledge, it hasn't been played in years. We should consider getting rid of it, maybe replace it with a couple of comfortable armchairs." A few of the other staff members nodded, but Maria felt a jolt go through her. She almost spoke up, almost said, "But you're wrong, it's played every single night." But she stopped herself. It wasn't her secret to tell. It was Alara's. For the next few days, the thought of the piano being hauled away and thrown out gnawed at her. She imagined the empty corner, the silence where there was once such beautiful music. She couldn't let it happen. She had to prove the piano's worth, not with words but with the music itself. The idea felt a little sneaky, a little like a betrayal, but it was the only one she had. One evening, she decided to do it. She waited until her rounds were done, until the home was wrapped in its familiar, deep silence. She took out her smartphone, her heart beating a little faster than usual. She walked as quietly as she could down the hallway and peered into the common room. There was Alara, just as she always was, a small figure, bathed in the faint, ghostly light from the street lamp outside the large window. The music was already flowing, a complex and powerful piece that seemed to fill every inch of the dusty room. Maria took a deep breath and pressed the record button. She held her phone up, trying to keep her hands steady. The screen showed a slightly shaky image of Alara's back, her white hair glowing softly. She zoomed in a little, focusing on the woman's hands as they moved across the yellowed keys. They were not the hands of an old woman. They were strong, sure, and full of life. Maria made sure the camera captured the chipped ivory keys and the scuffed wood of the piano to show its age, its history. She wanted people to see the beauty in something old and forgotten. The music Alara played that night was different. It was more intense, more passionate than usual. It was like a story, a whole novel told without a single word. Maria could hear a part of the story that was full of struggle, of climbing a steep and difficult mountain. Then there was a part that was soft and full of longing, like a lover's call across a great distance. The music swelled into a storm of crashing chords, a fight against some unseen force, before it slowly quieted down into a few soft, heartbreaking notes. It was the sound of a surrender, but a peaceful one. A single tear rolled down Maria's cheek, and she quickly wiped it away. She recorded for about 2 minutes, just long enough to capture the soul of the performance. And then she quietly stopped the recording and slipped away. Her heart pounding. Back in the break room, she watched the video. The quality wasn't great. The sound was a little muffled, and you could hear the faint hum of the air conditioner in the background. But none of that mattered. The raw emotion was still there, shining through the imperfections. It was real. She thought about Ilara, sleeping peacefully in her room, completely unaware that her private world was about to be shared. Maria felt a pang of guilt, but the image of the empty corner in the common room pushed it away. She typed out a simple caption, trying to find the right words. The most beautiful music comes from the most unexpected places. Meet our Ilara. She hesitated for a moment, her thumb hovering over the post button. Then, with a deep breath, she pressed it for the rest of her shift. She checked her phone every few minutes. Nothing, a few likes from her friends, a comment from her cousin saying nice. That was it. She felt a wave of disappointment. Maybe it wasn't as special as she thought. Maybe she was just a young nurse who was easily moved. The next day, she went to work, feeling a little foolish. The video had a grand total of 32 views. She had saved the piano for nothing, but something was happening online that she couldn't see. A local music blogger, a young man who spent his nights searching for hidden gems in the city's music scene, stumbled upon the video. He was tired of the polished, auto-tuned music that filled the radio. He was looking for something real, and when he saw Maria's post, he found it. He was captivated. He watched it over and over, listening to the way the music seemed to breathe. He wrote a short post about it on his blog, which was called The City's Soundtrack. He called it The Sound of a Soul Remembering Itself, and he embedded Maria's shaky video. That was the spark. The blog post was shared by a few hundred people. Then, a popular classical music forum picked it up. The members, who were used to discussing technical perfection and historical performances, were blown away. They debated the composer, the technique, and the overwhelming emotion. They shared the link on their social media pages. From there, it started to move faster. A big music-themed page on a social media site shared it, and their millions of followers saw it. Maria was on her break the next evening when her phone started to buzz. Not just one notification, but a continuous stream of them. She opened the app and her eyes went wide. The view count was in the thousands. Then, in a matter of minutes, it jumped to 20,000. Comments were pouring in. Who is this woman? I am literally crying at my desk. This is what real music sounds like. Someone please find her and give her a record deal. She couldn't believe it. Her hands were shaking as she scrolled through the comments. She felt a strange mix of pride and terror. The next morning, she woke up to a completely different world. The video had been shared millions of times. It was everywhere. Major news websites had picked it up. The headlines were bold and dramatic. The 80-year-old prodigy hiding in a retirement home. The performance that will make you weep. The viral sensation. Who doesn't even know she's famous? The quiet world of Sunnyside was about to be broken. Maria knew it was only a matter of time before the reporters showed up, before the phone calls started. She had saved the piano, but in doing so, she had put a spotlight on the one person who valued her privacy more than anything. She looked out the break room window at the peaceful, unassuming building, and then she looked down at her phone at the millions of views and the thousands of comments from people all over the world. They were all talking about Ilara. The forgotten girl was suddenly the center of the universe's attention, and she was sleeping soundly, completely unaware of the storm that was about to arrive at her door. The first sign that something had changed was the light. It wasn't the soft, morning sunlight that usually streamed through the windows of Sunnyside, waking the residents gently. It was a harsh, intrusive, flashing light that painted the walls of the rooms in strobes of red and blue. It was followed by a sound that was just as unwelcome, the low rumble of engines idling on the lawn. The quiet sanctuary, the place where time moved slowly and peacefully, was under siege. By the time Maria arrived for her morning shift, the situation had escalated from a curiosity to a full-blown circus. News vans from every local station were parked haphazardly on the grass, their satellite dishes pointing towards the sky like strange metallic flowers. Reporters with microphones emblazoned with different logos stood near the main entrance, their cameras poised. They were talking into their phones, their voices loud and excited, all of them looking for the same thing, a glimpse of the woman they were now calling the Sunnyside virtuoso. Inside, the atmosphere was one of chaos. Mr. Henderson, the home's director, was pacing back and forth in the lobby, his face red and his phone pressed to his ear. He was shouting into it, trying to make himself heard over the noise. "No, I cannot give you an interview. She is a resident, not a celebrity. Yes, we are aware of the video, but her privacy is our primary concern." Liability? Of course it's a liability. The other staff members were trying to manage the residents, who were peering out of windows and gathering in the hallways, their faces a mixture of confusion and excitement. They had never seen so much activity, so much noise in their quiet home, but in the middle of all this chaos, the person at the center of the storm was nowhere to be seen. Ilara had locked herself in her room. When Maria tried to bring her a tray of breakfast, the door wouldn't budge. She knocked softly. "Ilara? It's Maria. Are you okay?" There was no answer, just a profound silence from the other side of the door. Maria could hear the muffled shouts of the reporters from outside, a constant, oppressive noise. She imagined Ilara in her room, the sounds of the world she had long abandoned now beating down her door, demanding to be let in. The guilt that had been a small ember in Maria's chest now erupted into a fire. This was her fault. She had opened Pandora's box, and now Ilara was the one suffering for it. Throughout the day, Maria tried again and again. She would leave trays of food outside the door, which would remain untouched. She would speak through the wood, her voice pleading. "I'm so sorry, Ilara. I never wanted this. I just wanted to save the piano." The only response was the silence. Ilara, a woman who communicated through the beautiful language of music, had now chosen complete and total silence. She had retreated so far into herself that it felt like she was trying to disappear. The forgotten girl was now fighting with everything she had to be forgotten again. The world, however, had no intention of letting her go. The video continued its relentless march across the internet. It was being shared in every country, translated into dozens of languages. People weren't just watching it. They were analyzing it, debating it, and falling in love with it. Music critics from prestigious newspapers were writing articles, calling her performance a raw, unfiltered masterpiece of human emotion. The story was no longer just about an old woman in a retirement home. It had become a symbol, a reminder that true art could be found in the most unexpected of places, hundreds of miles away. In a world that could not have been more different from Sunnyside, a man sat in a room that was the definition of quiet. This was no dusty common room. It was a state-of-the-art, soundproof studio with walls of glass and polished concrete. The only furniture was a single, gleaming black grand piano that sat in the center of the room like a piece of modern sculpture. The man was Adrian Thorne, the most famous and celebrated concert pianist in the world. His name was synonymous with perfection. His performances were legendary for their technical brilliance, for their flawless precision. He could play the most difficult pieces ever written, his fingers moving with a speed and accuracy that seemed almost inhuman, but on this day, Adrian felt nothing but frustration. He had been practicing for hours, but the music felt empty. It was perfect, yes, but it was hollow. It was a series of perfectly executed notes, but it had no soul. He stopped playing, the silence of the room pressing in on him. He was a man who had conquered the world of music, but he felt like a failure. His assistant, a young man named Thomas, entered the room quietly, holding a tablet. "Sir, I apologize for interrupting," he said, his voice respectful. But there is something I think you should see. It's gone quite viral. Adrian sighed, waving a dismissive hand. Another cat playing the piano? I don't have time for internet fads, Thomas. No, sir, Thomas insisted, holding out the tablet. It's different. Just give it 2 minutes. Reluctantly, Adrian took the tablet. The screen showed a shaky, poorly lit video. He saw an old woman's back, an old, beat-up piano. His first instinct was to scoff. But then the music started, and everything changed. At first, his trained ear noticed the flaws. A slightly missed note here, a rushed tempo there. But as he listened, he began to hear something else. He heard the story behind the notes. He heard the decades of pain and joy, the longing and the love, all pouring out of this woman's fingertips. He recognized the piece she was playing, a notoriously difficult Chopin ballade, a piece he himself had performed hundreds of times. But he had never heard it played like this. He played it with technical perfection. She played it with emotional truth. He watched, mesmerized, as her hands danced across the chipped ivory keys. He wasn't just seeing an old woman. He was seeing a master. A musician who had bypassed the technical training and had gone straight to the heart of what music was supposed to be, a form of pure, unadulterated expression. In her flawed, imperfect playing, he heard the very thing his own perfect performances were so often criticized for lacking: heart. He felt a strange and unfamiliar feeling, a pang of professional jealousy, not of her newfound fame, but of her ability to connect with the music on such a deeply profound level. He watched the video 3 times, then 4. The outside world, his schedule, his upcoming tour, it all faded away. All that mattered was the sound of this forgotten girl's piano. He looked up at Thomas, his eyes intense and filled with a new sense of purpose. The sterile, perfect world he lived in suddenly felt cold and meaningless. He had to find this woman. He had to understand her, to learn from her. He had to speak to the person who had reminded him why he fell in love with the piano in the first place. He handed the tablet back to his assistant, his voice firm and decisive. Find her, Thomas. Find this woman. I don't care what it takes. Use every resource we have. Find her. The world moved fast for a man like Adrian. A phone call from his assistant, Thomas, and within hours, a plan was in motion. A private car, a discreet driver, and a journey away from the pristine silence of his studio towards a place he had only ever seen on a shaky phone screen. As the sleek, black car ate up the miles, the landscape outside the window changed from gleaming glass towers to sprawling suburbs, and finally to the quieter, tree-lined streets of an older town. But the closer they got to Sunnyside, the more the world outside began to resemble the chaos he had seen on the news. The streets were choked with cars. People with cameras were standing on sidewalks, looking like vultures waiting for their meal. The driver had to navigate through a crowd just to turn into the home's main entrance. "Sir, are you sure about this?" The driver asked, looking at the mob of reporters through the rearview mirror. "We can call security, have them clear a path?" Adrian shook his head. "No, just drop me off at the back entrance, if there is one." "I'm going in alone." Thomas had insisted on coming, on handling the details, but Adrian had been firm. This wasn't a business meeting or a publicity stunt. This was something else entirely. He felt a strange mix of nervousness and excitement, a feeling he hadn't experienced since he was a boy competing in his first music competition. He was about to meet a musician who had shown him more in 2 minutes than he had learned in 30 years of practice. The back entrance was less crowded, but a few clever reporters had found their way there too. Adrian pulled up the collar of his coat and kept his head down, ignoring the shouts of his name. He slipped through a heavy metal door and into the quiet, sterile-smelling hallway of Sunnyside. The contrast was immediate and jarring. Outside was a storm of noise and flashing lights. Inside was the soft shuffling of slippers and the faint beeping of a machine in a distant room. He found Mr. Henderson, the director, in his office, a man looking completely overwhelmed. "You can't see her," Mr. Henderson said the moment he saw Adrian. He didn't seem to recognize the world-famous pianist, just saw another person wanting something from his resident. "She has locked herself in her room." She hasn't eaten. She is terrified. I'm not here to put on a show, Adrian said, his voice calm and quiet. I'm just here to talk. Please, just tell her that another pianist is here to listen. He left his name, but it didn't seem to register. The director, seeing a calm and reasonable face amidst the chaos, reluctantly agreed to pass the message along. Adrian waited in the common room. It was exactly as it had looked in the video. The mismatched chairs, the silent television, and in the corner the old, scarred upright piano. He walked over to it and ran a hand gently over its dusty surface. He could almost feel the history in the worn wood, the ghosts of the melodies that had been played on it. He waited for an hour, then two. A nurse brought him a cup of tea, giving him a curious look. Finally, Mr. Henderson returned. She said no, he said flatly. She wants to be left alone. A wave of disappointment washed over Adrian, but it was quickly replaced by a sense of understanding. Of course she had said no. Why would she trust another stranger, especially one sent by the man who managed this besieged place? He couldn't just talk to her. Words were cheap. He had to speak her language. He dismissed Mr. Henderson with a nod and asked for some privacy in the common room. Once he was alone, he walked to the piano and sat down on the worn bench. It creaked under his weight. He placed his fingers on the yellowed keys, feeling the slight stickiness, the imperfections that his own instruments at home never had. He took a deep breath and began to play. He didn't play a showpiece. He didn't play the thunderous Liszt or the intricate Rachmaninoff that had made him famous. He played a simple, melancholic melody by Bach. It was a piece he knew by heart, a piece he had played 1,000 times. But this time was different. He intentionally let go of the perfection he was known for. He allowed a tiny hesitation here, a softened note there. He didn't play for an imaginary audience in a grand concert hall. He played for the woman who was hiding in her room, a prisoner of the very music that had set her free. He poured his own frustration, his own sense of artistic emptiness into the melody. He played with a vulnerability he had never allowed himself to show on stage. It was an apology. It was a plea. It was him saying, I understand. I see you. The soft notes drifted down the quiet hallway. In her room, with the pillow over her head to block out the world, Ilara heard it. At first, she thought it was a recording from the television. But then she listened more closely. This was different. There was a human quality to it, a gentle sadness that mirrored her own. It wasn't perfect. It was flawed. And in that flaw, she heard a story. She heard a man who was lost, just as she had been lost. Slowly, carefully, she got up from her bed and walked to her door. She unlocked it and stepped out into the hallway. She followed the sound, her bare feet silent on the polished floor. She stopped at the entrance to the common room and watched. She saw a man with his back to her, his shoulders slightly hunched over the keys, lost in the music. She didn't know who he was, but she knew what he was feeling. She felt a connection, a bridge being built between them across the silent space of the room. When he finished the piece, he let the final note hang in the air before fading into silence. He didn't turn around. He just sat there, his head bowed. After a long moment, he spoke, his voice soft and clear. You play stories, he said, still not looking at her. I only ever learned to play notes. Those simple words broke through something inside Ilara. It was the most honest, most understanding thing anyone had ever said to her. She slowly walked into the room and towards the piano. He heard her soft footsteps and finally turned. His eyes were kind and filled with a deep respect that took her by surprise. She sat down on the bench beside him, leaving a small space between them. They sat in silence for a long time. It wasn't an awkward silence. It was a comfortable one, filled by the presence of the piano between them. Finally, in a voice that was barely a whisper, Ilara spoke. I was supposed to play a concert once, she said, her eyes fixed on the keys. A long time ago, in a big hall with people waiting. But my hands, they just wouldn't move. The music was in my head, but it couldn't get out. She didn't need to say more. He could feel the weight of the tragedy in those few simple words. Adrian didn't offer sympathy or empty words of comfort. He just nodded. The world can be a loud place for a quiet music, he said. She looked at him then. Really looked at him and saw a kindred spirit. She saw a man who understood the pressure, the loneliness, and the profound joy of speaking a language most people only hear, but never truly understand. A small, fragile smile touched her lips. "Would you like to hear another story?" she asked. He smiled back, a genuine, warm smile that reached his eyes. "More than anything." The word spread quickly through the home. Not to the outside world, but within the quiet walls of Sunnyside. There was no grand stage, no tickets, no flashing cameras. Just a small gathering of residents in their armchairs, a few curious staff members leaning against the walls, and one world-famous pianist sitting on an old wooden bench, waiting like an eager child. Ilara sat at the piano, and for the first time in decades, she wasn't playing for herself. She was playing for an audience. But it didn't feel scary. It felt right. She began to play. The music that filled the room was the same passionate, soulful music from the video, but there was a new quality to it now. It was lighter, freer. It was the sound of a story that had finally found a listener. She played with a joy that was infectious, a sadness that was beautiful, and a love for the music that was absolute. And in the front row, Adrian watched, his heart full. He wasn't just a listener. He was a part of the duet. He was the other soul in the room, and in that moment, he felt more connected to the music than he ever had in the world's grandest concert halls. This was the performance of a lifetime, and it was happening in the most forgotten of places, for the smallest of audiences, and it was perfect. The last note of Ilara's impromptu concert hung in the air of the common room, a fragile, shimmering thing that seemed to absorb all the light and sound. For a long moment no one moved. The residents, who had been leaning forward in their armchairs, stayed perfectly still, their faces illuminated by the soft glow of the floor lamps. Some had tears tracing gentle paths down their wrinkled cheeks. Others simply smiled, a look of peaceful understanding on their faces. It was as if they hadn't just heard music. They had been told a story they already knew by heart, the story of their own lives, with all its joys and sorrows. Then a man named Arthur, who rarely spoke and always sat in the same corner chair, began to clap. It wasn't a loud, boisterous applause. It was a slow, soft clapping, the sound of two wrinkled hands meeting in quiet reverence. One by one, the others joined in. The staff members who were watching from the doorway added their own gentle applause. It was the sound of gratitude, of deep, heartfelt appreciation. It was more meaningful to Ilara than 1,000 standing ovations in a grand concert hall could ever have been. She sat at the piano, her hands resting on the keys, a small, tired smile on her face. She looked out at the small audience, at the people she had lived alongside for years, but had never truly known. In that moment, they were no longer just fellow residents. They were her listeners, her friends. She felt a sense of peace settle over her, a warmth that spread from her chest to the tips of her fingers. The fear that had been her constant companion for so many years had finally vanished. Adrian, who had been sitting on the bench beside her, was the first to stand. He didn't say anything. He just walked over to Ilara and gently placed a hand on her shoulder. She looked up at him, her eyes clear and bright. He didn't see the frightened woman who had locked herself in her room. He saw the musician, the storyteller, the woman who had just taught him the most important lesson of his life. He gave her shoulder a gentle squeeze, a silent exchange of understanding and respect between two people who spoke the same language. The quiet, beautiful moment, however, was not destined to last. The story of the private concert at Sunnyside was too good to keep secret. A staff member, meaning no harm, had posted a single picture on their personal social media account. It was a grainy photo taken from the back of the room, showing Ilara at the piano and the small, rapt audience in front of her. The caption simply read, "The most beautiful concert I've ever been to." That single picture was all it took. The internet, which had been buzzing with curiosity about the Sunnyside virtuoso, erupted. The narrative was now complete. The reclusive genius, the terrified artist, had been coaxed out of her shell by the world's greatest pianist. It was a story made for Hollywood, and the world wanted its sequel. The offers began to pour in. Not just to Adrian's agency, but directly to the retirement home's overwhelmed fax machine. The phone in Mr. Henderson's office rang off the hook. It was a dizzying, unbelievable list of opportunities. Carnegie Hall wanted her to open their next season. The most famous record label in the world offered her a contract, with a 7-figure advance and complete creative control. A major television network wanted to do a primetime special on her life, complete with a celebrity orchestra. They weren't just offers. They were promises of the fame and recognition she had walked away from as a young woman, all laid out on a silver platter. Maria, the young nurse who had started it all, watched the chaos with a sense of dread. She saw the way Mr. Henderson's eyes lit up at the mention of a donation from a wealthy benefactor who had seen the video. She saw the way the reporters who had been kept at bay were now finding new ways to get their story. She worried that this new wave of attention would be too much for Ilara, that it would crush the fragile spirit she had just seen bloom, but Ilara, surprisingly, was calm. She listened as Adrian patiently explained the offers to her, translating the jargon of the music industry into simple terms. He didn't push her one way or the other. He simply laid out the possibilities and waited. He had learned his lesson. This was her story, not his. Elar thought about the grand stages, the bright lights, the thousands of faces she wouldn't be able to see. She thought about the pressure, the expectation, the need to be perfect. And then she thought about the common room at Sunnyside. She thought about the worn wooden bench, the chipped ivory keys, and the small, familiar faces of her audience. She thought about the feeling of playing not for fame or for money, but for the simple, pure joy of sharing a story. One afternoon, she sat down with Adrian and Mr. Henderson. The director had a stack of papers in front of him, a look of eager anticipation on his face. "So," he began, "which one will it be?" "Carnegie Hall is a very prestigious offer, Ilara. Think of the exposure for the home." Ilara looked at the stack of papers, then at Mr. Henderson, and finally at Adrian. She took a deep breath. "Thank you," she said, her voice soft but clear. "Thank you all for thinking of me. It's more than I ever imagined." She paused, choosing her words carefully. "But my stage is right here. My audience is right here. I don't want to go on a tour. I don't want to make a record." Mr. Henderson's face fell. "But the money, the recognition—" "I have all the recognition I need," she said, a gentle smile on her face. "I have my music back. That's enough." There was one offer, however, that she did accept. It wasn't from a concert hall or a record label. It was a small, handwritten letter that had arrived with the rest of the mail. It was from the music teacher at a local community center, a place that offered free lessons to children who couldn't afford them. The teacher wrote about a young girl, a shy but incredibly gifted student who had the technical skills but lacked the confidence to perform, who played the notes but couldn't seem to find the music within them. The teacher had seen the video of Ilara and wondered if she was ever willing, if she might be willing to talk to the girl, to perhaps share a little bit of her wisdom. Ilara read the letter and knew, instantly, that this was her answer. This was her legacy. Not in a sold-out arena, but in a small practice room, passing on the one thing she truly valued, the courage to play from the heart. The final scene takes place a few months later. The news cycle has moved on. The reporters are gone. Sunnyside has returned to its quiet, gentle rhythm. But something has changed. The old piano in the common room has been tuned and polished. It no longer has a wobbly leg. And it is no longer silent. Ilara is sitting on the bench, and beside her is a young girl, no older than 10, with bright, nervous eyes. Her name is Lily. Ilara is not teaching her scales or exercises. She is telling her a story. "Every note has a feeling," Ilara says, her voice soft and encouraging. "This one," she says, pressing a key, "is like the first drop of rain. And this one," she presses another, "is the sun coming out after the storm." She gently guides Lily's small hand to the keys. "Now, you tell me a story. Don't worry about playing it right. Just play it true." Lily hesitates for a moment, then presses a key. It's a simple, hesitant note. But then she presses another and another. The melody that emerges is simple, a little clumsy, but it is filled with a child's wonder and a newfound confidence. Ilara listens, her eyes closed, a look of pure contentment on her face. The world's attention had been a fleeting, chaotic storm, but the music remained. And now it was being passed on, one quiet, heartfelt story at a time. The forgotten girl was no longer forgotten, because she had made sure her music would never be.